Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Lilly Lin, Executive Director at Russell Reynolds. Lilly advises clients on broad talent management issues, including succession, leadership development, and assessment. Over the course of her career, Lilly has worked with large, small, for-profit, and mission-based organizations, establishing herself as a trusted advisor who is highly skilled in preparing clients for the near and long-term succession needs. She is an active member of the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology and is often chairing or speaking at SIOP's annual conference. We go deep on succession planning. In other conversations on the podcast, we have touched on succession planning a little bit here and there. We go really deep into leadership, like CEO type succession planning, how to think about it, when to start it, how to approach it, how to have conversations, how to deal with multiple candidates, internal, external, all of that stuff. Really fascinating conversation. And as you can imagine, or if you've seen the show Succession, it can go wrong in a lot of ways. So really fun, insightful conversation here with Dr. Lilly Lin. All right, that's all. Here is Dr. Lilly Lin. Lilly, welcome to the show. I'm excited to have you. We met recently and had just connected over breakfast the other day, and we're having such a fun conversation that I thought it would be worth doing a part two and recording some of it. Excited to have you on and learn a little bit about succession planning today. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, and excited to impart whatever knowledge I can to the community.
Yeah. So how did you get into succession planning?
Yeah, so a little background on me. I went into IO psychology and I got my doctorate there several decades ago, and then started work with a human consultancy company that had an executive assessment and development arm to it. I was too young at the time to really be taken seriously, so I didn't get into that work immediately. But toward the tail end of my time there, started to do more work around executive assessment and development. And then since then, have actually worked for a handful of human capital consultancy firms. And through that time, I've really just been able to see things from different angles. And as I joined a search firm called Korn Ferry, that's when I really started getting more exposure to succession management, especially since in the search world, you're dealing with the top of the house. There was more opportunity for me to get exposure to that and to see how we could use assessments to really support succession management. And then went to Deloitte and did some work there around succession management strategy, and then landed here at Russell Reynolds about 4 years ago and have really been focused in that area more recently with credit unions, as we're really starting to understand that there's a great need there to be helping these companies figure out what their succession plans are. So that's really where I'm spending a lot of my time these days.
Okay. And when we talk about succession planning, like, how do you define succession planning?
Yeah, anyone who's seen the show Succession, that's really created a good platform for us to be talking about succession planning, because it's essentially a what not to do when it comes to thinking about replacing the founder, the leader of an organization, and doing it haphazardly or allowing it to be squishy so that a lot of noise comes into the process and you end up creating a lot of consternation for the family involved, if we're talking about a family-owned business, or even for the board and the leadership team as a CEO or a C-suite individual is really thinking to leave the organization. So succession planning is really the idea behind being thoughtful and proactive, knowing that the inevitable will happen. Somebody will ultimately retire, leave the company, in less fortunate situations, maybe perish in some ways, or become unavailable to do the job anymore. So the sooner that an organization has an idea of situations where that's anticipated and can begin engaging in a more thought out and diligent process, that's really what we refer to as succession planning. It's just being thoughtful and planning for that ultimate occurrence. It's anyone who gets married, there's a wedding. You don't just show up that day and decide to get married. In some cases people do, but for the most part, there's some thoughtful process that goes into making sure that event is successful.
All right. So when the work you're doing then, because I think of succession planning and I get what you're saying of like the leader and focused on the top dog. But are you also working below that level to help figure out, okay, whoever steps into that role, somebody's going to have to step into their role as people on the full executive team, or maybe even leadership levels below that as they step out or they step up? Like, how are we filling those jobs? Are you getting into that trickle down succession planning too, or are you just more focused on the senior leader because that's so critical?
There is a trickle down effect. At Russell Reynolds, we do tend to really only engage at the top of the house.
Sure.
So when there is this now need for replacement underneath, that is sometimes handled by either the organization themselves internally, or there might be other firms that are working more at that level. That said, I am currently helping a client where we are looking at those that report into the current C-suite members, and we're actually going out there and assessing them to determine how ready they will be to step into those roles. In this case, it's because a lot of the C-suite members are close to retirement age. It's not because any of them are going to be moving into the CEO role. But yes, we do help our clients think through that. Where it's at the level that we engage with clients, then yeah, we can oftentimes work with them, assess them, and help them figure out what's next. But when we start to get down into the lower ranks, there are a lot of companies that do work around potential pipelines and high potentials and are creating programs, even like down to the front line or next level up leader, and identifying those people who are hypos so they can start to fill a pipeline and a bench that ultimately helps the organization prevent from having to scramble at the last minute when an opportunity opens up. So they may even have these pools of people that they might start to zigzag across the organization in order to give them the experiences that they need to then be this holding tank of talent that can be ready to step into those roles when the opportunity allows.
Got it. Yeah. And we'll keep it more on the executive level for this conversation, but I was just curious how deep into the organization your work actually went. So it seems like on that second part, like there's a lot of work to be done in evaluating all the talent and creating those pools and building those experiences. Even though replacing the top leader is just one person, it seems like there's maybe equal amount of work just dedicated to making sure that gets done correctly. Why is changing out a leader so hard for an organization?
Yeah. One, because a lot of people don't like to talk about leaving their current role, right? Even when any of us are leaving an organization, it's kept pretty under wraps, right? It's something we might not even share with the company until we decide to leave. So that's one example of why succession has to be proactively thought of, because HR and talent management can't always be fully aware of when an executive plans on leaving. Now, if they're getting closer to retirement age, it's a little bit more evident, or it's something that like, hey, this person is probably going to want to retire soon, so we should be having conversations with them about it. And then the case of CEOs and founders, let's first talk about the founders. So these are people who created the organization, oftentimes are what we call the patriarch of an organization. Again, thinking back to succession, a lot of these founders have a really hard time just even thinking about what life outside of work might be, or that there is another life for them after the company, or coming to terms with the fact that they're not getting any younger. And I don't think I'm spoiling anything with the show Succession, but it all started when the patriarch was realizing that he had some health issues. And then that's what spun off the situation. So if you think about it, there's this humanizing element of it that is hard sometimes for people to think about, especially if they created the company. With the work I'm doing with credit unions, a lot of these CEOs, I'm working with one right now, she's been in the organization for 40 years. Her entire life is connected to this credit union. And then she's been the CEO for 20 and was actually married to the founder before she stepped into that role and doesn't have children.
This is her life.
This is her life. She doesn't have children. There's nothing else to distract her and pull her away from being in that role, although she and her board realize that this is something that she really absolutely has to get on and start to do. But for her, yeah, when I start talking to her about her departure, and we are now engaging in succession planning with her, she does get a bit emotional and teary about it because this is her life. This has been her identity for so many years. And then in other cases with succession, let's talk about the bad performer, right? That's one where they don't plan on going anywhere, but the board really wants them to go elsewhere or leave or step down because they are not doing their job correctly.
Yeah.
So those are really I'd say 4 examples of when somebody will leave and why succession planning really needs to be put into place before that kind of either immediate event happens, that surprising event happens, or even the eventual event happens.
Yeah. So let's talk about the 2 kind of surprise ones, which would be, one would be like CEO gets hit by a bus. The second one would be CEO's underperforming, they get fired, we need a new leader. Is this something where there should always be a next person up? Or is this something that does having a next person up create weird dynamics? And the reason I ask that is I just listened to a podcast interview talking about dictators on the Jordan Harbinger show, if anyone wants to check that out. The expert who was on that show was talking about how in these dictatorships, you have a king, and they tried for a while to have, it was originally like standard for the king's brother in Europe to be the next one up. But a lot of brothers killed the king. And so they were like, we can't do that anymore. And so then they made it the youngest child of the king. And then that they weren't old enough to have any real gravitas when they stepped into the role. And so then they decided on the oldest child, which sort of created just enough gap that they weren't going to threaten their lives, but they were old enough when the person passed on that realistically they could step into that role. And so while we're not talking about like feudal Europe here, humans are humans. And if you're in an organization and you're the next person up, like, does that create weird relationships and dynamics with the leadership team? Answer that however you want. I know that's kind of a weird question, but I'm just curious, like, how you think about next person up versus like when is the appropriate time to have somebody identified?
Yeah, I think it depends on the clout of the position, right? At the CEO level, best practice is there should always be a succession plan in place. We often even say, and we place CEOs, right? As soon as that CEO is named and steps into that role, they should immediately be thinking about their succession plan because the average tenure of a CEO is 4.7 years, according to recent research, because it's a tough job. Even if you still have it in you to be the CEO, your board is wanting a new perspective and wants to bring somebody in. So with CEO succession, that's maybe a little dicier because it's such a big role. But people do generally, especially the companies engaging in best practice succession planning, have some sense as to whether or not they're part of the successor pool. And of those, when that emergency situation happens, then that's when some kind of more strict evaluation process happens or an accelerated development program gets put into place to help prepare that person quickly. A lot of companies now are being expected to have an emergency CEO replacement plan. So the board is really often pushing for that. And usually the CEO just says, if I like to say win the lottery, if I win the lottery or am beamed to another planet, then this is the person that I think could actually run the organization.
I would imagine they generally do that on an interim basis. So it's okay, we know that if this person steps out, we have this person's going to step in as an interim, and then we'll do our more formal search or approval process based on that. But it's just to create at least some level of stability.
Yeah. Sometimes there's 2 lists. One is this is the emergency replacement, but then there's another list. These are the viable successors to the CEO. It's like, you just hold down the fort, please. A lot of times it's the CFO, honestly, because the CFO understands the business really well. And it's hard for you to find somebody with high financial acumen and understanding the books to come in and be able to take over.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are often 2 different lists. The other thing around the heir apparent kind of thing, as we look maybe down one level with C-suite members, good talent management practice is, let's say you have a team of talent management people, is to, during talent reviews, constantly be pushing and forcing each C-suite member to name who they think would be their successor. So it's an active discussion, or it should be an active discussion taking place between the executive team and their talent management partners and the CHRO. The CHRO should really be overseeing and making sure that there's thought going into what happens if something ultimately changes the course or the picture of things.
Yeah. I imagine in that type of a process, there'd be like some element of trust but verify. The person in that role is going to know and have insight into who they think could do that role. But then we're also human beings and we play favorites, and we might have somebody who is a favorite of ours that we want to get the role because we want to help them out, but they're not actually the best person to step in that role. So I imagine there has to be some kind of check and balance to that.
Yeah, there is. Again, I'm talking from best practice here, but talent review discussions should be taking place, if not quarterly, twice a year. And that's where you get the senior executive team together. On their agenda is specifically to talk about the lay of the land, the landscape of talent, and who they would put forth as their successor. And then you have the rest of the executive team weigh in, raise their hand if they don't feel like that's the right person, or challenge a little bit.
Yeah.
There's also this notion of successor pools too, where I once sat in on a talent review with a client, and they actually had a pool of people that they thought were top talent. So people actually sit in those pools and may actually go into a different function or a different part of the business and become a successor to somebody there. One, because it's good for them to get more of that enterprise-wide mindset or perspective. But two, because they are such top talent and have the learning agility necessary, while it might be a little rocky at first, they are the person that the leadership team thinks could ultimately do the job and bring about some good business results.
Okay. So let's back it up a little bit because I jumped out ahead, but let's say you get hired by an organization. They have some CEO succession work that they want to do. Where do you begin? What does the actual work look like to start to figure this stuff out?
Yeah. If we're just talking about CEO succession, the first step is to create a success profile. A lot of times what can happen is the board may have the CEO in mind, and it's like, we just need another O'Brien, right? Or this person's doing so well, we just basically need to clone this individual and they become the next CEO. So what we try to do is start with a blank slate and talk to board members and other relevant stakeholders. The current CEO is often involved in those discussions as well. And we talk to them about external factors that are impacting the organization. What do they see as being viable strategies and visions for the organization? What are the leadership characteristics or capabilities that they're really looking for? And what's the culture of the organization? So by asking those questions, we're now starting to get a picture of what would be required for that next CEO. And we're really getting them to think in the future, right? Because some of this work actually starts, if an organization is on top of it, 3 to 5 years in advance of when the CEO plans on leaving. So it's really pushing the board to be thinking about what is the company of the future and what do we need in order to run that. So that's really the first step there.
Yeah, because it seems to me, I had this conversation with my coach yesterday. We were talking about stepping into new roles and the concept of doing that with an offensive mindset versus a defensive mindset. And I think if you're just looking for the next Jeff Bezos or whoever the CEO is, then you're getting a lesser version of that person who's just trying to perpetuate what that person did. And you're not getting somebody to come in with a different perspective or a different skill set that can take you to a new place. Mm-hmm. And so while I imagine there's a ton of value in figuring out like what is the core of us and what makes us so special. and let's find somebody who's going to really grab onto that and then bring in new perspectives and push us to be an even better version of that core thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the cool part about this exercise is board members are very different, right? They come from different walks of life. And so they're going to have a very different viewpoint on what is required for the future or what they see the organization being in the future. So this exercise not only gives us a little bit of one-on-one with the board members and to hear their unique perspectives, but ultimately when we pull together the success profile, there's a bit of a vetting process that we go through as well to get the board aligned on what they'd be looking for. And I'd say it's a 50-50 chance that you actually have a board that is thinking the same way about the organization and about the CEO. I'm dealing with a company right now where they just went through a merger. So they acquired their biggest competitor. And you've got two very different board perspectives. They were doing the same business, but obviously each of the organizations were operating very differently. So now as we're going through the CEO succession process with them, and I'm actually asking each board member of these 4 people who we are now putting through this program, which would you vote for? It's all over the place. And it's crazy to be thinking about them ultimately one day being in a room together and having to make that decision. But that's the role that we're playing right now, is to give them as much information as we can so that they can get a little closer to a unanimous vote, or unanimous might even be way too impossible, maybe even just a majority vote on who they think should be that person. So
at least create some alignment.
Exactly.
So where do we go from there then? We've got this assessment done. We know what success profiles look like. Where do we take that?
So at this point, there are probably a few names of people within the organization that the CEO and the board has been thinking of. So these are your internal candidates. And this can start further out, right? This can start 3 to 5 years out. Those people then will go through an assessment process that is founded on the success profile that we created with the board. And the assessment process can be made up of a variety of tools, right? There's psychometric assessments that we use at Russell Reynolds. We also engage the person in a pretty in-depth interview with a psychologist like me, and oftentimes a search partner who really understands the market, so they can provide that external perspective or benchmarking on that individual. We also engage in 360s. So how is this person even showing up in the organization? If they were named the CEO, would there be a revolt or would there be celebration? So that's a way for us to really get a sense of what's happening actually in the workplace that we can leverage and use. A lot of times there's performance information that we can use as part of that. And then also cognitive ability tests sometimes are used. Is this person a critical enough thinker? And are they able to engage in the right systemic thinking to be prepared and ready for the changing environment of the marketplace and be able to adapt and bring the right brain, I guess, so to speak, to lead the company?
So on that last piece, is there a right brain for a CEO role, or does it have to match with the success profile?
Yeah, there's no right brain, but
okay,
we actually are looking for people who can take complex information and connect the dots and be able to see things from a bigger picture. Now, it's not the end all be all. In fact, some people get a little itchy when we talk about cognitive ability measures, because the person wouldn't have gotten to this point, let's say a CFO, if they weren't smart, or if they didn't have the brain power to get there. But it is one additional bit of evidence and information that can sometimes be helpful when you're thinking about, okay, you've got the brain power to do this job, but do you have it to do the CEO role?
What does the cognitive ability test do? Is it just measuring IQ, or are the questions shaped for some kind of application, distillation of information? I would just be curious. I guess I've taken a lot of assessments. I don't know that I've ever taken a cognitive ability assessment.
Yeah, there's different types. There's some that are more word heavy. It's called the Watson Glaser. It's like a conditioning reasoning test. It's similar to the LSAT. Can you
Okay.
take information and reason through it? Obviously, there's issues there if people are like English isn't a second language, not really recommended there. If we're talking about US based companies, though, they should be able to read something like that, make sense of it, and do well since they're going to be communicating in English most of the time. There's other tests that are less language heavy, and they'll present like these shapes and figures, and you have to figure out which one's the next one. And they get really hard, and they're timed as well.
Okay.
That's supposed to get abstract reasoning and thinking. And then there's others I'm not as familiar with, but I think we do use them from time to time, which gets more at deductive reasoning, problem solving, that type of thing. But again, we don't always use cognitive ability assessments, but I wanted to throw that in there as the universe of types of tools that we sometimes use when we're assessing people.
No, it's interesting. That is internal candidates. And I imagine some of these are the same, but talk about external candidates. So when does an organization, when should they get maybe a feel for, hey, we've got great internal candidates and we should do that, versus it's might be time to bring someone in from the outside?
Yeah. So that's why we start early, right, with the internal candidates, because let's say we're 3 years out. Are any of them even potential successors? Do they have the raw ingredients to become a CEO? If we go down that path and we are like, no, unfortunately, they're a great marketing officer, they're a great GC, but they just don't have all the ingredients that we need to get there with some shaping and grooming, then at that point, in this example I was just sharing with the board that's comprised of 2 different companies, we are right now taking these 4 candidates through an accelerator, a CEO accelerator. So we're really putting them through the grinder, evaluating them, doing 360s on steroids, also trying to create a program by which these 4 people now are going to present to the board more often and demonstrate their strategic thinking and also demonstrate their ability to get results.
Yeah.
In the past, these 3 of the 4 individuals there was a bit of a veil in between them and the board because they were management committee. But now that you start looking at them as a CEO contender, that's when you open the door and allow the board to get more exposure and familiarity with what they bring to the table. Because ultimately the board's going to then have to make a decision on these 4 people.
Yeah.
So we're putting them through an Excel.
I just ask a question on this. Has somebody, I assume this might be the dumbest question I've ever asked, but has somebody asked these people whether they want to be the CEO?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they need by going through this program. And one of them actually just recently got added because she didn't see herself as a contender. But this past year, as she's gone through helping the 2 companies integrate, I could do this. I could maybe become the CEO. And she's showing up really well in front of the board. One of the members just said to me, she's like a totally different person.
Yeah.
Also, we said we didn't think she was interested because of the growth that she's gone through in the past year. She might be a dark horse, honestly. Yeah. I'm currently talking to each member of the board right now about her because that's part of this accelerated process is what would get in the way of you nominating this person as the successor or voting for her.
Yeah.
And so they get real honest. These are the things you need to help her through in order for us to start to see her at the same level as the one that's the front horse in the race.
Yeah. I would think there's an element where if I were on a board making this decision, I would really respect somebody who came in and said, hey, I didn't think I wanted this, but I've given it a ton of thought and I've thought about what it would be and how I would do it and what success would look like. And I think I can do this. And I think I'd really enjoy it versus somebody who's just, I want to be CEO.
And on the flip side, honestly, the front horse is not going through training and doing all the little exercises he needs to do to present his best self. He has stood us up a few times. He doesn't respond to my emails when I tell him this is your homework. There's a bit of overconfidence and arrogance, honestly, that I'm seeing, which he needs to understand his data. I'm going to feed that back to the board and say, his heart doesn't seem to be in it. He's got 2 younger kids. And I think he's now starting to come to terms with the fact that I'm not going to be able to see them in their very critical moments because I'm going to be on the road all the time.
Yeah. And
so,
what kind of coaching do you provide, or do you encourage them to get to think through that stuff? Because I think that is critically important, to really think through, what do I want my role to be? Personally, there was a role that opened up in our organization a couple of years ago, and one of my friends who is on our executive committee came to me and jokingly, but also serious, was like, would you be interested in this role? And it was a total shift, a totally different role than the one I'm in now. And I was like, on the surface, it's intriguing, but I actually sat down and wrote it out and was like, what would this look like? And I realized that it would not be as fulfilling as the job that I have now. And not that it's not a great job. It's just that it wasn't aligned with where I was and what I want, my goals. And so I was able to pretty clearly feel good about saying, no, I'm going to stick with what I'm doing.
Yeah. Yeah. All 4 of these individuals, 2 of them have always been interested, right? One's kind of been deemed the heir apparent. He's got a title that often is indicative of the fact that, and he might even be the emergency successor, right? Another one is like a little whippersnapper chomping at the bit and just really wants to be a CEO. And then there's a third who came from the other organization. He was the CEO of that company. They were smaller. So he's obviously a contender, right? And then this woman who's come out of the dark and is, hey, I want to try this, right? I'd say one of the things that we do when we first put them through the accelerator is we conduct a 1.5-day session with them. And it involves them telling their story, like their life story. And we ask them to compartmentalize their life into chapters, talk about the highs, talk about the lows. What were their emotions as they were going through this? We then ask them to pick from a list of, I think it's 50 words, the 3 values that mean the most to them, right? Because what we're trying to do is get them to get their head around what their brand would be as a CEO. So it's really getting them to be really introspective. And as they're going through that process, seeing it all displayed out there on a wall and thinking through that helps them begin to make a little bit more of the connection into, do I really want to do this? What kind of CEO am I going to be? What would I look like as the leader of this organization? Then we also have an expert come in who has now placed over 100 CEOs. Name a Fortune 500 company, he's somehow been involved in that process. He understands what the makeup of a CEO is, right? So he then gets up there, he presents the 13 tenets of CEO success. And it's at that moment that you really see these participants like, wow, either yes, I checked some of those boxes, or what, I have to do that. It's going to be that lonely and scary. It's going to be that difficult. So that's another moment where they come to terms. I also do a personality assessment debrief with them to just remind them, here's what you bring to the table that could help or get in the way of your success. And then by the end of the day, we ask them to think about, okay, you're at your retirement party. What speech are you going to give, or what do you want the person who's introducing you and saying words to be saying about you? So they're almost visualizing it.
Yeah, I've heard that write your own eulogy type thing.
Yeah, yeah. Because there's something very personal about this that not everyone thinks about. And honestly...
Yeah, your identity becomes tied up in it. Like you were talking about with the woman who's been at the credit union for 40 years. We are status animals. And so to be put in charge of a group of people of any size and to be running that group, even if you're only doing it for the 4.7 years, like it becomes a part of your identity and your status. And so understanding the impact of that and how you want to leave it, I think would be important.
Yeah, for sure. And the cool thing is me and my co-facilitator in these sessions are having the opportunity to see all 4 of them go through this process. And I have to tell you, 2 of them were not showing up as well in this. It was still very much, I want it for the title, not I want it because I truly want to do good for the world. And that's data that we continue to use and feed back to the board. And then this day and a half long session then ends with them creating a short, mid, and long-term horizon development plan. We at Russell Reynolds as coaches work through and just continue to keep tabs on them on a monthly basis and see how much effort they're really putting into tackling that plan and making it happen. Because there's only so much we can do, right? We're not sitting at their desk next to them. This is where we're also testing the motivation and the degree to which they are really investing in their development to get them to where they need to be.
Yeah. So let's take this example with the 4 contenders. I know we're not there in the process yet, but if I'm on the board and I'm vetting these 4 people, should I just assume that once we make a final decision and that person is either announced or they actually get into the CEO role, that we're going to lose the other 3 within a certain period of time after that? Should we just know that's the game that we're playing? Or is there a way to help us retain those people? Is there something we can do to have a softer landing than losing 3 other great leadership candidates?
Yeah. One thing, so 3 of the 4 that have been working for the same company are friends. They've been working together for years. They've been part of the management committee together. They're pretty intertwined, and like they each represent such an important part of the business that I've heard for the most part that if it's one of them, the other 2 will get in line and be supportive. So that's one way in which we're mitigating that risk. The other is this notion that I've presented to the board and am now sharing more with who I'm talking to, more of a cabinet type solution than a king at the top with people underneath them doing things for them. It's a king with then 2 really very tied together advisors that are helping that CEO, at least initially, as they're getting into this role, filling it, to run the business. So it's more of a...
Is that important then? Like, even if you're not going to do the triumvirate version, but is it important to, if you want to keep those people, to be very specific about what their landing spot is and the role that they're going to play going forward versus just saying, hey, thanks, but we're going to go this route? Like, it seems like it would be worth doing extra work to create that soft landing and say, hey, we think this other person is going to be the CEO. We still want to keep you involved. And based on everything that you've shared and the evaluations we've done, we think this would be the next best spot for you here.
That's what I'm trying to do in my conversations with them as we've been doing these day and a half kickoff sessions. And that's the bug that I'm dropping in the board's ear as I'm talking to them right now, is let's maybe start to have this more open-minded approach, something that's a little different, that's not traditionally how it's done, but in this particular situation might be the right solution. So you have a CEO and 2 presidents or something along those lines. Now, for the poor person who's coming from the other organization, I even had a touch base with him. It's becoming more evident to me that I don't know if I can make up for the time that, especially his counterpart, who's been the heir apparent, I don't know if I can make up for that and be able to do all that in the next year and a half to be considered a serious contender. So that is very likely a retention risk. Yeah. If one of the other 3 gets selected, I do think we could if we kept the 3 together, they might stay and it would be less disruptive to the organization. And that person, he's so qualified. He'll land in a great place, but he's definitely, I'd say, he's definitely fighting a much more uphill battle and has his hands tied a little bit there.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with losing people at the end of a process like this if it's the right thing for either or both sides of the table. And like, I think about when I started at Lockton here in Chicago 16 years ago, we had a practice leader in our benefits practice. And he was great and was a great mentor to me. And he, at some point, decided that he was reevaluating the trajectory of his career and he wanted to be CEO somewhere. He wanted that opportunity. And we didn't have that position available. Like, it just doesn't exist in our organization. There would be no path for him to get there. And so he went out and he found another path to get there. And he is a CEO right now. And from everything I can see from the outside, he's doing a great job. And I assume that it's what he wanted and he got it. And that's great. And like, good for him. That opportunity was out there and he went and found it somewhere else. And I just think often we're losing and we can't lose that person. But if that person has a goal that we can't offer, then why wouldn't we help them go find it somewhere else?
Right.
There's a little bit of competition in there. And so I get that element of it, but it just seems like we squeeze on a little bit too tight when maybe we could be having some more open, honest conversations and helping make sure that the people who want to stay have great feeling about the role that we're putting them in, and the people who would burn out or leave anyway, that we're sussing that out and helping them get to a spot that's better for them.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I really empathize with this individual because he was the CEO. It was like a short period of time and he loved being the king of a kingdom. And it sounds to me, from what I was hearing from the board, he was good at it. And it wasn't like a power thing. It was like he really enjoyed having that kind of impact on the organization at that level. So he's going down that path and then it gets taken away from him. And he's pushed back into this organization in some ways, like demoted, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's still in a high role, but suddenly he went from being able to be strategic and calling the shots to now fix this substantial problem that we have in the organization. So he got the short stick in all this. Yeah. And then now is having to clamber back up and demonstrate that with an executive team and a board that doesn't really know him. But he's willing to do and jump through the hoops and do what he has to do. And I told him, I, as an outside person, am going to advocate for you as much as I will for the others. Ultimately, if he doesn't get it, I mean, he's a catch. He'll be snatched right up.
That's what I was just thinking, is if he doesn't get the job, it's not necessarily a failure, because it sounds like he's getting a heck of a training program to enhance skills that he didn't have before to make him an even more qualified person. And if you get to the end and you're not the right fit for that job, that doesn't mean there isn't another really great opportunity right around the corner. We all have stories in our lives of the blessings that came to us from the things we didn't get.
Yeah, for sure. I think for the most part, everyone feels like even if they were affected by a riff or something or other, as long as they didn't do anything terribly bad, it's just unfortunate luck. In almost all cases, people ultimately look back on that and think that was the right thing for them because they ended up moving to a better place.
Yeah. Just a funny aside, when I was in high school, really wanted to go to the University of Virginia, which is where two of my cousins went. And everything I had heard and seen about it was like college. This is what it should be. And I applied early. I got rejected. I actually drove down and had two family friends who were friends with the dean, and they faxed them letters saying, if you're reading this right now, O'Brien's probably sitting in your lobby. And they reopened my case and then deferred me again. So rejected me again. And we're like, you could transfer in, but we're not going to let you in this way. And I wound up going to Miami of Ohio, and it was the best thing that's ever happened to me. And so actually behind my diploma in the case, I still have both of those rejection letters, just as a reminder that life can work out.
Yeah. That's a great story.
Yeah. One other thing I just wanted to highlight, I don't know if this is a question, but I didn't ask this directly necessarily, but it seems like you've hit on it, is this concept that if you're starting 3 to 5 years early, I imagine you're not necessarily looking for somebody who is fully baked CEO ready tomorrow. Like, so how do you help organizations assess the potential of somebody? Because I could see sitting in a room and looking at a group of candidates and going, this person doesn't have this and this person doesn't have that. And I don't see anybody here who's ready. We need to go to the outside. So how do you help them see the potential and get their heads around the development process of a CEO?
Yeah. I'll go back to that raw matter, right? And not to be too like nebulous about it because we can't get it right all the time. But often what we're looking for is, again, looking at that profile. And when it comes to some of the more ingrained personality elements of it, that's why we do the 360s. We want to know, is this person like leave bodies in the wake but gets the results kind of person? Are they somebody who's technically amazing but doesn't have the confidence in themselves to do it? There's these kind of different pictures that can be painted about the person that helps us determine, okay, that person might have it, right? And even if we identify them as somebody who has potential, we're not carving in stone, this is going to be
you're not anointing them today.
So oftentimes there might actually be several people that are now on this path, and let's put them through boot camp now, and let's see which ones actually make it through, and then ultimately have the capability and the skills to do it. A lot of times it comes down to experience, right? So these people have shown a great deal of potential in terms of dealing with complexity, dealing with hardships, and they've really shown through it. So that oftentimes is a real indicator that this person has the tenacity, the grit, the motivation, and the authenticity and personality to be an incredible leader. But have they led an entire organization? No. You don't get that opportunity until you step into that CEO role. In fact, that's one of the things, a colleague of ours wrote a book called The New CEO. That's one of the things he calls out is, you will never have done a job like this. And you can have in your mind how hard it is. It's that times 1,000 because you're alone up there. You're having to trust your gut and your instinct. You're having to demonstrate the confidence in your own ability, that kind of thing. And you've never done it before. Maybe you've done something at a smaller scale. It's training for a marathon. Run a marathon every day. You're doing like up to maybe 13 to 16 miles or something, but you never run the full marathon. And you don't know until that day whether they're not going to make it past the finish line. So it's a little like that. People will have kind of tastes of the challenges that they'll face as a CEO, but they'll never fully experience it until then. So when we do this 3 to 5 years out, we're like, okay, these are things that are going to come naturally for you, but these are things that we got to get you plugged into and exposed to in order to start to scale you up and see whether or not you can handle things at that level.
Yeah. I think a lot of NFL teams seem to be getting this wrong. So maybe you could carve out a niche in the NFL, because I was reading an article recently about why Bill Belichick was so successful as a head coach, and he had so many great coordinators and very few of them went on to be really good head coaches. And it was talking about how unless you are the head coach, you can't know what it's actually like to be the head coach, and that the head coach is more of a CEO role, whereas the underlying roles are more like executive management roles, but you're still a subject matter expert in something, whereas the top coach role is more the CEO. And it was just it was a really interesting article around that thought. You can't just enhance the skills you already have as an offensive or defensive coordinator and become a great coach. Like, you have to take your knowledge and apply your knowledge, but you also have to embrace all these new skills and behaviors. And that's where a lot of coaches fail. And I just hear you saying the same thing and being super purposeful about how you are both assessing those people for that ability, but then also prepping those people for that ability in the lead up to this.
Yeah. And the amount of effort that gets put into the development of these people is equally as important as the effort leading up to assessing and evaluating them.
Yeah.
We now know what the keys to their success will be. And if we're not really purposeful in ensuring that they're getting what they need to unlock those doors, then you could have a diamond in the rough, but you never really nurtured it and got it to a point where it could then shine. So I think there's a little bit of that too, is like this process reveals to you what these people need to work on, but it's just as important then to act on that and give them what they need. Or in the evaluation process, yeah, you're terrific at this particular technical element, but can you go meta and be looking at it now in terms of how does my knowledge of what's required there translate into what I now need to do as a leader in order to teach other people how to do it. Right?
Yeah.
So,
all right, we've made it close to the end here. We've picked a candidate. We're going to move forward. What are the conversations like to help the existing leader cede control, or to help the incoming leader have the patience that maybe this transition is going to take a little bit longer than they thought? Like, what are some best practices in actually making the transition?
Yeah, there's two scenarios, right? The first is the person from the inside is named the successor, and that's your best situation because usually this outgoing CEO has been their leader. So there's already rapport and trust and all that built in there. It's a little easier for a CEO to give it to somebody that they have been nurturing throughout the years, right? But there's something to be said about having a transparent and clearly laid out transition plan. And by the way, a little statistic, it's more often than not that a CEO comes from the inside.
Interesting.
It's pretty rare. Even though we're in the search business, it's really hard to find a CEO that you can helicopter in, drop into the organization and be successful. It does happen, especially if we've got a turnaround situation. You've got to get new thinking and blood in there to change things up. But so in the case of the internal, it's more important to have that established plan because it can be suddenly we got this. We're familiar with each other. When I leave, you'll be fine. And then they're not doing the things and having the conversations and having that transfer of responsibilities taking place in a more diligent way. And that's where we sometimes come in and are in some ways like a marriage counselor, right? Helping them really be thoughtful and communicative about what that looks like. And sometimes what happens is the CEO doesn't just ride off into the sunset, but they sometimes want to stay connected to the organization because it's going through such great change. There've been like a lot of elements and transformation that they just started getting the organization down the path of, and they feel really bad leaving the person high and dry and saying, okay, I'm going to go now, play golf. Some of them might actually come in and become a board member, like a board emeritus. So they're still there and there to be a safety net for a little bit while the new CEO is really trying on their new clothes and getting comfortable with it.
Yeah.
Now that can be risky because it might be too much of a safety net and we're not letting the bird jump out of the nest and fly. So that has to be managed really well as well. Some CEOs even stay on as advisors. So they're not part of the board, which is good because they're not in those quarterly meetings and still really like ear to the ground on what's going on in the business. And so it separates them a little bit so they're not micromanaging, but there's somebody that the person goes to for advice and support and help.
Yeah.
But the external side, that gets a little bit more dicey. That's where you start to see the outgoing CEO get a little testy because now they're like, this person's coming in and taking over, like I'm giving my baby away.
Yeah, they're coming into my house. I know
nothing about the person. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's where it's important for the board to be thinking through what the right amount of time is for that transition period. Sometimes some CEOs are like, left the keys under the mat. Have fun with my office. You've got this. Others are like, no, I want to stick around and I want to make sure that I help this person understand the culture and some of the things that may not be all that evident on day one.
Yeah.
And some of them can be real jerks and make it really uncomfortable and difficult for the person to transition in.
What are the characteristics that make a really good leadership transition team?
I'd say one, and this is not me trying to plug our products and services, but we're starting to be brought more in to that transition period because we've gotten to know the person pretty well, either because our search colleagues really understand and know that person. They also understand the organization. So they know where some of the tough spots are going to be. So we can be there as external advisors and smooth that over a little bit.
Yeah. So a willingness to get some external advisors and some expert perspective and coaching through this kind of thing, knowing that there's a lot that could go wrong.
Yeah, especially for somebody who might be first-time CEO.
Yeah.
There's a lot of noise there and discomfort and fear and anxiety that we can sometimes help them
Yeah.
through.
I hear in what you're
Yeah.
saying too, like a group humility and openness, vulnerability, maybe just a willingness to all be in it together.
That's the hope. But unfortunately, we don't see it happen all the time. Like the hope
Well,
would be the
humans
person
are messy.
leaving. Yeah, the person leaving has no ego involved. Like they truly care about the success of the organization through this transition period. So they're willing to do whatever is necessary to make it a success.
Yeah.
And that's where the board needs to step into because the board is there for the interest of the organization, not the CEO. So at times they may have to be a little hard on the CEO and get them out of the way if they think that's going to prevent the incoming person from being successful.
Yeah. That makes sense. All right. I have this one question on here just because you mentioned succession early and you mentioned at the end, sometimes people behave badly. What are some of the craziest things you've seen people do when it comes to this CEO succession?
Yeah. We were working with this one wine company, family owned. So the CEO is the third generation and wasn't doing well. The company is, I think, nearing bankruptcy, basically. So they asked us to help with the search. But as part of that external search, also wanted us to evaluate their internal candidates. There were 3 that the CEO actually thought could be potentially a CEO. I don't think he thought they were ready at this moment, but he also had a lot of loyalty, right, to his team. So we did the external search. We put so many amazing candidates in front of the board. And as we were going through the process, the CEO was still involved and really just putting a wrench in everything, just throwing tantrums. Nobody was ever good enough. Oftentimes he would miss phone calls or meetings that we needed to have to advance things forward. So ultimately, the board chair started just realizing this is a mess. And she fired herself and the rest of the board and said,
Oh, really?
we all need to step down because they were all board members because of personal relationships that they had with the CEO. And she, good for her, because she's an astute businesswoman, was like, we're too close. This is getting too close for comfort. I don't think we're being objective. I don't think we're doing any favors for this company by staying on. So they replaced the entire committee.
Wow.
And these 2 poor external candidates have been kept warm forever. I assessed both of them and I decided this is the best person. Let's make this person the offer. Put it in front of the board. The board ends up picking the CFO, which the new board ended up picking the CFO because there's still just so many internal politics going on.
Yeah.
And they just felt like it was the best way to appease the outgoing CEO and just wipe their hands of what a mess that had been created by the prior committee. So
yeah, people are messy. That is for sure. That's why I've been able to do over 200 podcast episodes on a show called People Business, because there's just no end to the stupid stuff that we do in the name of our own ego or whatever. Lilly, this is fantastic. I appreciate you coming on and talking through all this. We covered a ton today. It went by very quickly. Any final thoughts that you have that we didn't cover?
I think we've been pretty exhaustive, but happy to answer further questions as they might be coming in, O'Brien.
Yeah, where can people reach you? Because appreciate that you didn't want to come on and make this a sales pitch, but by the same token, this is what you do and people have these needs. So if they do want to continue the conversation, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I work for Russell Reynolds Associates. And so you can just look us up online, and there's a way that you can get into my bio through that if you want to look for me.
I can link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, that'd be great. Or if you want to just provide my email address, they can certainly contact me directly that way.
Okay.
Thank you for the platform and the opportunity to talk about succession.
Yeah. This stuff is so interesting. Yeah. And it's so interesting. And to your point that we've made probably too many times, like it can go so wrong in so many ways. And so to really be thoughtful in how you do this, and not just thoughtful, but early in the process too. I think it's great advice, and there's a ton in here for people to take and put into practice.
Yeah. It's not rocket science. It's really quite simple. It's just,
but it does take intention.
It does. But taking a more deliberate approach to it can maybe help tamp down the emotionality and the weird human behavior that might come from not having a process in place. And if you haven't watched Succession, have fun. There's 5 seasons for you to enjoy, and it'll be a nice thing to binge watch. If you
scare yourself into hiring some help when you're going through your next CEO succession.
Exactly.
All right. Good luck to everybody out there listening. Thank you as always for tuning in. And Lilly, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.